Good morning, students. In today's session, we are going to take up the poem Marshlands, written by Emily Pauline Johnson. Now, the poem Marshlands, the poet paints a beautiful picture of life which exists in marshlands. Now, I hope we all know what are marshlands. We all might have seen marshlands sometime in our life. Marshlands are areas that are continuously covered with water, that is usually still and stagnant, with wild grass that grows around. So, the poet describes the thin and wet sky that covers the marshlands that can pour down and drench the land anytime. The poet also describes the cranes, geese, and the lizard that reside here among the moss and the reeds. The poet brings out the beauty of animals and organic life that survives in the marshlands and is generally looked at with hatred by the onlookers. So, this was a little introduction to the poem. So, let us start with the first two lines. As I read, I hope you have the book with you. So, a thin wet sky that yellows at the rim and meets with sun lost lip the marsh brim. So, in the first line, the poet describes the sky over the marshes, which appears to be thin and wet, as if it is going to rain very soon. The sky has got a yellowish tinge at the edge of or the rim, as it is evening or the sunset time. Now, coming to the second line, and meets with sun lost lip the marsh brim. So, this sky, this yellowish, wet, and thin sky, it meets the brim or the top edge of the marsh. So, the rim is the top edge of the marsh where the sun has vanished. So, the sun has vanished at this point, the top edge of the marsh. Now, this place where the sky meets the marsh, it has been described as the lip of the marsh, and the sun seems to have gone inside this lip. The words lip and brim, they denote that this ecosystem, this marshlands, this it is contained, and it is separated from the rest of the world. It is a world in itself. It is separated from the rest of the world. So let us move on to the next two lines. The pools low-lying, dank with moss and mold, glint through their mildews like large cups of gold. So the poet says that the water in the marshes, it is low-lying and it is very cold. It is unpleasantly cold and it is covered with moss and mold. That is the fungus. Okay, moss and mold is that fungus which is there, which has grown on the stagnant and the still water. But now the next line, glint through their mildews like large cups of gold. So although this water is stagnant, it is covered with moss and fungus and mold, but still at some places this water is shining. It glints through. Glint is shining. It glints through. It shines through its fungus. Like huge golden cups, because it's evening time, the sunset, the yellowish sunlight, it is falling on the water and the water is shining like gold. So, moving on to the next lines, among the wild rice in the still lagoon, in monotone, the lizard shrills his tune. So, in the next this line, the poet describes the wild rice that grows in marshlands. The poet describes marshlands as still lagoon. Now we all know lagoon is a seawater lake, the seawater lake which is separated from the rest of the sea. And because the word is used here still, so the water is stagnant here, and we've studied this in the previous line, the water is stagnant. But still, there is life, there is presence of life here in the stagnant water also, like wild rice and the lizard which is singing in a monotonous tune. Monotonous means same tune, the lizard is continuously speaking in the same tune. All these details, they help to create an imagery of marshlands in the minds of the reader. So when we read about the wild rice growing around the marshlands and the lizard, so kind of image is created in our minds regarding the marshlands. And now the lizard has been personified here because as its tone, it has been described as shrill or having a tune. Now, personification, I hope you all know, personification, it is a literary device where some humane characteristic it is given to some other less or inanimate objects to give importance or to emphasize or to create an imagery. So here the lizard has been personified because the poet says that it is singing. Usually the lizards, they don't have that kind of voice which we can call it singing. Usually the human beings or the birds, they sing. So here the lizard has been personified because the poet says that the lizard, it sings, it shrills his tune. So move on to the next line. The wild goose, homing, seeks a sheltering where rushes grow and oozing lichens cling. So here in these lines, the poet describes that these marshlands, they are home to wild goose, which takes shelter among the rushes or the long grass and the oozing lichens. Now, lichens, they are small grey-green plants that spread over the surface of the trees. So these lines, they show that these marshlands, which appear to be dead and unpleasant lands, they are important and they are home to so many kinds of plants and animals. So we can say they are a world in itself, although they appear unpleasant to many of us. We don't even like looking at them because the stagnant water, the moss and the fungus growing on it, and the wild reeds growing around. So they are a world in itself. So moving on to the next two lines, late cranes with heavy wing and lazy flight sail up the silence with the nearing night. So the poet says, as the poem progresses, as the poem moves forward, the evening time, the sunset time, it changes into a night. So the night falls as the poem progresses. And the late cranes, the ones who haven't flown yet, now they take up a lazy flight with their heavy wings, and they start sailing upon the prevailing silence. Now it's silence because the night has fallen, so they start sailing upon the prevailing silence. Now they fly in peace because they're not in hurry, they're not in any kind of rush. So moving on to the next line, and like a spirit swathed in some soft veil steals twilight and its shadows over the swale. OER is over. Okay, it's a short form written here. So, in these lines, the poet describes how night has set in and it takes over the land. It comes over like a spirit, swathed. Swathed means covered, covered in a soft veil. Now, veil is a kind of covering on the face, no? A cloth which covers the face. So the night comes in like a spirit which is covered with a soft veil, and it steals the twilight. We all know what is twilight. Twilight is the time between the day and the night, or the night and the day, when it's neither properly night, dark, or nor properly daylight. So it's very dim light. So when the night sets in, it steals the twilight. Whatever light was left, the night steals that also, and takes away all the shadows present in the marsh. So all the long shadows which were there in the evening time, in the twilight, they are all taken away. They are all stolen by the night when the night falls. And finally, the darkness spreads around. Now, coming on to the last two lines, hushed lie the sedges, and the vapors creep, thick, grey, and humid, while the marshes sleep. So, in the last two lines, as the night has fallen, so the poet says there is silence all over. Hushed, the word hushed means silence. And the sedges are the kind of plants which are growing in the marshes. Now they are also silent. And the vapors, they start creeping. So the vapors, the water starts evaporating from the marshy water, the pools. They start creeping. Creeping means they're rising very slowly. So because it's very cold, so maybe the water starts evaporating, like fog starts rising from the water. So it's rising very slowly. That is why the poet has used the word creep. Creeping means walking slowly or rising slowly from the cold and wet marshes, and the air turns thick and wet with the fog. So the whole air of the marshes, over the marshes, now it is thick and it is wet with the fog. And the whole ecosystem of the marshes, it has become thick and grey and humid, as the marshes and the life present in the marshes, it sleeps. So that finishes the poem, and I hope the poem is clear to you. So do read the poem once again and try to go through the question answers. We'll discuss later. Thank you and have a nice day.